Lately, there's this thing going around. It's not a new idea, but it's become more popular in the last few months because of what's happening in Israel. This notion that, Jewish-Muslim relations before the state of Israel were always very good. That, the Muslims treated Jews very well, especially compared to Christians. That the only reason that there's a supposed conflict between Jews and Muslims is because of the state of Israel, because of Zionism. And there's often this refrain that, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. And if it wasn't for Zionism, that like Jews and Muslims, everything would be just fine. And we've probably all heard this idea. It's become very popular. And even, you even hear Jews saying it, the Nature Carta, those like ultra-Orthodox, anti-Zionist Jews talk about all the time. Lately it comes up on my YouTube feed a lot, these Nature Carta, and they're always saying this, that no, it's because of the evil Zionist entity that Muslims now hate Jews, and before that, Jews and Muslims always got along, and Muslims always treated Jews so well, and we lived so peacefully. So we hear that a lot lately, and I want to explore that. Is that actually true, or is it a myth? So that was the idea. I wasn't originally planning to do this class, but I pushed off the other topics because it keeps coming up over and over again, and I think it's important to actually address it. Is that true? Were Jewish-Muslim relations throughout history over the last 1,400 years that Islam has existed, have they really been good? Did Muslims really treat us well or better than Christians did, and so on? So that's the question. And I want to start with a letter that was written by the Rambam, Maimonides, the great Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Just to recap, he was born in the year 1138. He passed away in 1204. He was renowned not only as one of the greatest rabbis of all time and the chief rabbi of the Egyptian Jewish community, but also he was a great philosopher. He's known as Maimonides, and he played a very instrumental role in bringing together ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, together with religion, with monotheism. So he was able to bridge together Greek wisdom with the Abrahamic traditions, and that's also why Christian scholars also would cite Maimonides. So for example, Aquinas, a lot of people have heard of Aquinas. He cites Maimonides in his works at least 2 or 3 times, and many others. So he was known as this great philosopher, a great scientist, and also a physician. He was a doctor, and he was the personal doctor of the very famous Saladin, Sultan Saladin, who was the leader of Egypt at the time, and of course famously fought the Crusaders and was able to recapture Jerusalem for the Muslims from the Christians. So the Rambam was also the personal physician of Saladin and the court physician of his entire dynasty, the Ayyubid dynasty. And so a really great man, a great legislator. You can see statues of him around the world. There's a monument to him in Cordoba in Spain where he was born. There's actually even a relief of his face in the Capitol building in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington. So you can see a relief of Maimonides there as a great legislator and philosopher and thinker and physician. And his medical treatises are still studied today. And there are hospitals named after him in various places around the world. So a really important, monumental figure is Maimonides. In Judaism in particular, he wrote some really important works, and he wrote really the only complete Jewish code of law. The Mishnah Torah remains the only comprehensive and complete code of Jewish law that covers everything. There are other codes of Jewish law, like the Shulchan Aruch, which is more popular, but the Shulchan Aruch only covers the laws that apply today. The Rambam's Mishnah Torah covers all laws, even laws that apply when the temple is built, about Mashiach, about all these things, sacrificial rules, all the stuff that don't apply today, that we haven't done since the temple was destroyed. The Rambam codified even that. So he covered everything. And I want to devote a separate class to the Mishnah Torah and how the Rambam completely transformed Judaism. There's a popular saying that mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam od ke Moshe, that from Moshe, the first Moses in Egypt, Moshe Rabbeinu, until Moses Maimonides, until the Rambam, there was none other like Moses. So from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. That the Rambam was as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. He was like the Moses of his generation. There's like the mystical idea that there's a Moses in every generation, that there's like a leader of the Jewish people like Moses in every generation. So the Rambam was certainly the Moses of his generation. And maybe some even on a more Kabbalistic level would say that he was the reincarnation of Moses. So the Rambam was the reincarnation of Moses. So he was a really important figure. So he was born in Cordoba. At that time, Cordoba in Spain was ruled by the Muslims. As we know, this was before the Reconquista of the Spanish. And so he was born there. He lived the first 10 years of his life in Cordoba. And he was aware of what was happening right next door in the Catholic part of the Iberian Peninsula. He happened to be living under the Muslim part. And when he was 10 years old, there was a new dynasty, new regime took over, the Almohads. And the Almohads were very extremist. And they started persecuting Jews. And they basically forced everybody to either accept Islam or die. And they repealed what's called the whole idea in Islam of being a dhimmi. A dhimmi is somebody who's not a Muslim, but like not a pagan. So like Jews and Christians, namely, were dhimmis. So the Muslims would allow Jews and Christians to like live in their lands, but they'd have to pay a tax, the jizya tax, and they basically have to be like second-class citizens. So they were inferior to the Muslims, and certain restrictions were imposed on them. So they couldn't build any new churches or synagogues, and they couldn't, depending on the time and place, the status of a dhimmi and what that meant varied. In some places, being a dhimmi meant you couldn't own land, or you couldn't buy any new land, or you were excluded from certain professions, or you didn't have certain rights. Often you couldn't ride a horse, you couldn't ride anything, you couldn't ride a camel or even a donkey in the city. You'd always have to walk, and maybe you'd have to walk on the other side of the street, or if you walked by a Muslim, you'd have to like put your head down, or you'd have to wear some identifying feature. In fact, the earliest known, the whole idea of the yellow star, like the Nazis had this yellow star, have the Jews wear a yellow badge. The earliest known version of that is actually from the Muslims, for the dhimmis that were expected to wear a yellow badge to identify themselves. And they couldn't proselytize, so like Jews and Christians couldn't spread their religion in any way. You couldn't ring a church bell or blow the shofar. You couldn't do any of these things. And you had to pay a sizable tax as well to maintain your status. So I'll just read from one decree from Baghdad in the year 1121, which said that for Jews, they had to wear 2 yellow badges, one on their headgear and one on their neck. And each Jew must hang around his neck a piece of lead weighing 3 grams with the word dhimmi on it. He also had to wear a belt around his waist. The women have to wear 1 red shoe and 1 black shoe and have a small bell on their necks or shoes. So these kinds of restrictions were placed on Jews and also on Christians to basically humiliate them, to make them, to kind of like force them ultimately to want to take Islam to make their living conditions better. That was the idea. So yes, you can live among us, but you will know that you are inferior, that you are a second-class citizen, and the idea was eventually you will embrace Islam. Jews lived with that status in Muslim lands. The Rambam and his family did as well. He came from a long line of rabbis. So they lived in Cordoba. Things were okay, but when the Almohads took over, they repealed this whole idea of being a dhimmi. You either accepted Islam or you were going to be killed. So the family fled at that point, and they moved to Morocco, which was still under the Almohad rule, but it was a little safer over there, and they lived there for a time. He became a physician. He wrote his first great book, the commentary on the Mishnah, over there, and already started to make a name for himself as a great scholar. And then in 1165, one of his rabbis, who was called Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen Ibn Susan, he was the chief rabbi of Fez in Morocco, and he was actually publicly forced to convert to Islam or be killed. He was kind of put on display as the leader of the Jewish community. The Muslim authorities thought, if the rabbi converts, then that'll inspire that'll make the entire community, Jewish community, convert to Islam too. And of course, Rabbi Yehuda refused and was publicly executed. And so things got really bad in Morocco as well. So the Rambam fled and his family fled once again. And this time they tried to go to Israel, which at that time was ruled by the Christian crusaders. And the thing is that the crusades and the wars between the Christians and the Muslims and all that actually had a really terrible impact on the Jews. And Jews were also slaughtered by both sides, by the Crusaders and by the Muslims at various times. And the whole Jerusalem Jewish community was like decimated. And the Rambam found not much there. And the Jewish community didn't really have any infrastructure, and there weren't many of them left, and it was not a good place. So ultimately they didn't stay in Israel, and then the family moved to Egypt, and they settled in Egypt in 1168 when the Rambam was 30. So interestingly enough, he soon became the court physician and became the personal doctor of Saladin, and in 1187 Saladin recaptured Jerusalem. So it's just interesting to point that out. I often think that if the Rambam didn't take good care of Saladin probably wouldn't have been able to recapture Jerusalem in 1187. So the Rambam must have done a good job, because Saladin was in good health for a very long time. So he served the royal family for a long time, for at least 2-3 decades. Even he continued to serve, he continued as court physician even after Saladin passed away. So for the Jews, he was soon recognized as the greatest rabbi in the world, and he would receive letters from all over the place, and he would send his responses. And the Yemenite community was particularly attached to the Rambam and really respected him and asked him, corresponded with the Rambam regularly. And in Yemen, there was, another a dynasty. The regime in Yemen was also very hostile to the Jewish people. And there was one particular leader called Abd al-Nabi ibn Mahdi, who was also very fanatical and was trying to basically either have everybody convert to Islam or be killed. And the Yemenite Jews were experiencing a great deal of persecution. So in the year 1172, their chief rabbi, Yaakov ibn al-Fayyumi, he wrote a letter to the Rambam. And he asked him for advice and for help. And so the Rambam wrote a very lengthy letter. And it was written in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic, which is kind of like the Jewish dialect of Arabic, the dialect of Arabic that Jews spoke. And he wrote a very long letter it was like a chizuk. It was like to inspire them, to strengthen their faith, to tell them that everything will be fine, and to give them a blessing that all will be well. And amazingly, his blessing kind of came true, because the very following year, in 1173, that dictator, Ibn Mahdi, was deposed. And actually the persecutions of the Yemenites subsided for a little while, and the community was not destroyed. So the Rambam gave them a blessing that, have faith, everything will be fine. And within a year, things actually got better. And because of that, the Yemenites were actually so grateful to him. It's a very well-known little thing that the Yemenites added to their Kaddish the Rambam's name. So you know how when we say Kaddish, when we say Bechayechon uv'yamechon, and they would say, we say Ufchayed dechol Bet Israel, right? So they also added Bechayechon uv'yamechon Ufchayed de Rabbana Moshe ben Maimon. So they actually put his name into the Kaddish, so that every time they recite Kaddish, they wished the Rambam well. So he wrote a very lengthy letter. It covers a lot of things. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. And he even gave a little calculation there for when he thought Mashiach would come. It's very funny because he writes there that, of course, you're not supposed to calculate, you're not supposed to try to predict when the Messiah would come, but then he did it anyways, right? Which is the truth with everybody, right? Like many of the great rabbis said, like, hey, you shouldn't make predictions, you don't want to give people false hope, but it might be this, right? So when I posted that last class that we did, will Mashiach come this year? Like a lot of people were saying, like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you making these predictions? I'm like, listen, I'm not a prophet. I didn't say it. I said, maybe it's a suggestion. It's okay to give people hope. And in the past, all the great rabbis said, don't make calculations. And they did all anyways. So the Rambam gave his own calculation as well in that letter. So maybe I'll come back to that at the end. So I want to go through the letter. I want to go through the 2 paragraphs where he specifically talks about the relationship between Judaism and Islam, between Jews and Muslims, the house of Jacob and the house of Ishmael, because it's absolutely fascinating. And I think every sentence here is so powerful and really needs to be explored deeply, because he encrypted it so beautifully and weaved it together with biblical passages, biblical verses. It's really poetic. It's really beautiful. So I want to go through it step by step. And keep in mind that the Rambam, again, he knew what life was like under Muslim rule and what life was like under Christian rule, under Catholic rule, in Catholic Spain, under the Crusader kingdoms, in Jerusalem. He lived all over the place, in Spain, in Morocco, in Israel, in Egypt, under both Muslims and Christians. So keep that in mind. This is what he says. So he starts like this. Remember, my brothers, that on account of the vast number of our sins, God has hurled us in the midst of this people, the nation of Ishmael, who hate us and persecute us severely, and passed baneful and discriminatory legislation against us, as Scripture has forewarned us. And he's quoting from Parashat Ha'azinu, from Deuteronomy, from Dvarim, our enemies themselves shall judge us. Okay, this is the verse. I'll read the entire verse. In Parashat Ha'azinu, there is remember, Parashat Ha'azinu is Moses' last song to the people, to the Israelites, before he passed away. So it's at the very end of the Torah, and he really gives it to them, to the Israelites, and the song is really deeply powerful, encrypted with a lot of information. It used to be customary for Jews to actually read Parashat Ha'azinu regularly, some even every day, or even to memorize it. So one of the verses in Ha'azinu, it says like this. Eicha irdof echad elef. So how can one pursue 1,000? Ushnaim yanisu revava, and two are able to push away 10,000. Imlo kitzuram mecharam ve'Hashem izgiram. How can it be that we find in Jewish history and in recent history in Israel, when you think about, let's say, the War of Independence, right? Israel declares independence, and immediately a handful of Arab nations declare war on Israel, and Israel was outnumbered, 100 to 1. There was only 600,000 Jews in Israel at the time, and hundreds of millions of Arabs, and it's outnumbered more than 100 to 1. It has to fight 5 professional armies, and they're able to win the War of Independence. It's an absolute miracle. Nobody thought they could win. The Arabs thought that it would be super easy. The Arabs thought the Jews are crazy. We're going to destroy them. We're going to drive the Jews into the sea. We're going to obliterate this new Israel. They didn't even think of any alternate scenario. They were so sure that when Ben-Gurion declared the state of Israel, they were certain that it was just suicidal and they would destroy Israel very quickly. And nobody thought that Israel would win. Till this day, they call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. It was so they couldn't even fathom that such a thing could happen, that Israel, with basically nothing, with old weapons that they smuggled from Europe, they only had their Air Force, the Israeli Air Force at the time, had 4 old, falling apart Czechoslovakian airplanes that they had to disassemble, smuggle into Israel, reassemble. And if you read the accounts of the war, there's absolute miracles. Just one miracle after another, with a small handful of Jews are able to push away hundreds, thousands of Arabs. Even with the Air Force, just 4 little airplanes were able to take on larger air forces from the Arab nations. And we see this throughout. And God is saying here in Parashat Ha'azinu, in the Torah, God is reminding the Israelites, you've seen these miracles. How is it possible that one of you can make 1,000 flee? Right? Or 2 of you can make 10,000 flee. Don't you realize that it's because God is helping you? It's that simple. In the same place, God is saying in Parashat Ha'azinu, he says, Zachor yamot olam, binu shnot dor vador. Just look back in history and you'll see. There's nothing more miraculous than Jewish history. Right? That's the best proof that you can. There's an old saying that the King Louis asked Blaise Pascal, the philosopher and mathematician. He says, give me one piece of evidence, that miracles are real, that God exists. And he said, just look at the Jews, right? Look at Jewish history. So this is what it says here in the Torah. God is saying, just look back at your own history, and you see all the miracles, and you'll know that I am with you. It reminds me of a story. I've shared it before, but I have a neighbor who's an Iraqi Jew, and his father came to visit, who's already in his 80s. His father came to visit, and we had them over for Sukkot, and he was a veteran, and he fought in the Yom Kippur War. And because he was Iraqi, and he spoke Arabic fluently, he was born in Iraq, so they stationed him with all the Egyptian. He was stationed at the Sinai, and they had him watch all the POWs, the Egyptian POWs, and they told him to gather intelligence, listen in on their conversations in Arabic, because they didn't know that he speaks Arabic, and pass on the info. What do you hear from the soldiers there, from the officers? And so he told me that he heard them saying that it's impossible, we can't win. That the God of the Jews is protecting them. It doesn't make sense. No matter what we try to throw at them, it doesn't work, right? They always win. So, and I asked him, I said, you always hear these stories that their rockets wouldn't work and all these miracles that hundreds of their tank divisions would just flee for some reason. I'm is this true, or it's just hocus pocus, baloney that people like to make up stories? And he told me, he said, listen, if I wasn't there and I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't believe it. This is 100% true. So I saw it with my own eyes. Right? Rockets flying and then suddenly just falling to the side, plopping over, weird stuff. You think it's about to hit and doesn't work. Right? He said he saw with his own eyes, miracle after miracle. And he told me, he said, if I wouldn't have seen it, I wouldn't have believed it. Right? So these are the kinds of things that we see throughout Jewish history and even in recent history and in Israel. So going back to Ha'azinu, to this verse in the Torah, it says, how could it be that you are so small and yet so powerful that you're able to hold off people who outnumber you 100-1. And to this day, Israel's outnumbered. Then there's at least 100 Arabs for every one Israeli Jew, right? And at least 100 Muslims for every one Jew in the world. And then the verse continues. It says, "Kilo chetzureinu tzuram." Their rock is not like our rock. Ve'oivenu plilim, and this is a key word here. That's what the Rambam is citing. What does that mean? Kiloch surenu tzuram. That their rock is not like our rock. This is the Rambam encrypting a very powerful message. Why the rock? What does that mean? The rock is one of the names of God in the Torah is the Tzur Israel, the rock of Israel. Here in Parashat Ha'azinu too, it begins, if you remember, by saying Hatzur Tamim Po'alo, that God is like the righteous rock. He's the rock of Israel. And so this verse is actually beautiful because it's saying that their rock is not our rock, right? Our rock is the rock of Israel, is God, and their rock isn't. So it's interesting that the Rambam quotes this. You might miss it when you read it, what does this have to say? Because if you think about the relationship between Islam and the rock, Islam is centered in Mecca, in the Kaaba, which is a shrine with a stone. And they go and they circle it and whatever. And there's always discussions, is this some kind of pagan ritual left over from the pre-Islamic Arabs that used to also worship this stone, and that got carried over into Islam? I'm not going to get into that, but it's interesting to point out that the two most famous Muslim shrines on the planet is the Kaaba in Mecca and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So there's this association between Islam and the rock. And there's an association between, interestingly enough, in the Torah, there are a few verses where God tells us, don't stray after the gods of wood and stone. Don't stray after those religions of wood and stone. So, of course, the pshat, the simple meaning there is, don't worship idols made of wood and stone. Fine. But there's a deeper meaning there that our sages noted that this is an allusion to wood and stone is an allusion to Christianity and Islam. Christianity is all about the wood, the cross, the wooden cross, and Islam with the rock. Those are symbolic of these two faiths these two religions that are offshoots of Judaism, that detached from Judaism and kind of took our scriptures and made it their own. It's kind of like the original cultural appropriation, and added to our scriptures and adopted it and adapted it. So our sages saw those verses when God cautions us not to stray into religions of wood and stone, that it was actually secretly alluding to Christianity and Islam, one of which is symbolized by a wooden cross and the other by a stone. It's interesting to point out. So the Rambam is actually cryptically alluding to this here in this verse, where he's saying, hey, their rock is not our rock, right? Their rock with a lowercase r and our rock with an uppercase r. And the verse ends by saying, Ve'oivenu plilim, that our enemies judge. What does that mean, our enemies judge? Ve'oivenu plilim, it seems really ambiguous. What does that mean, oivenu plilim? So he's saying that our enemies, he interprets this as if our enemies God uses our enemies to judge us. So it's something that, again, appears in the Torah in a few places. God says, if you guys go astray, I'm going to use the nations around you to punish you. Right? It's all coming from me. and this will happen. If you start going astray, I'm going to wake you up, and I'll use the nations around you to judge you. There's this idea. And I'll come back to that idea a little later at the end. Because I want to bring also a famous prophecy from the Zohar that talks about this. So the Rambam quotes this verse, just to justify, to say, like, this is why this is happening to us. So the Ishmaelim, the house of Ishmael is treating us really poorly. Ultimately, it's because we were sinful, and God is using them to judge us. Okay. He continues, and he says like this. This is the important part. The Rambam says, never did a nation oppress, degrade, debase, and hate us as much as they. And he says, therefore, when David, king of Israel, inspired by the Holy Spirit, envisaged the future tribulations of Israel, he bewailed and lamented their lot only in the kingdom of Ishmael, and prayed on their behalf for their deliverance, as is implied in the verse. So he's quoting here from Psalms, from Tehillim, Psalm 120. Woe is me that I sojourn with Mashiach, that I dwell beside the tents of Kedar. That's the verse. Who is Mashiach and Kedar? The Rambam says, note the distinction between Kedar and the children of Ishmael, because Muhammad is from the lineage of Kedar, as they readily admit. So the Muslims themselves say that Muhammad is a descendant of Kedar, and Kedar is the son of Ishmael. That's the lineage. That's how Abraham, Ishmael connects down through Kedar to Muhammad. And Muslims themselves admit that. Muslims say that Muhammad came from Kedar, the son of Ishmael. He is going back to the Torah in Genesis and Bereshit, chapter 25, where we read about the sons of Ishmael. And it says, Ele shmot bnei Ishmael. Ishmael had 12 sons. Bechor Ishmael Nevayot. So his oldest son was Nevayot. And then Kedar, Ve'adabel, Umifsam, Umishma, Ve'duma, Umasa, Hadad, Ve'teima, Yatur, Nafish, Ve'kedma. Those were his 12 sons. Elehem bnei Ishmael, ve'ele shmotam, bechatzreim uftirotam, shnei masar nesim leumatam. They were 12 sons, they became 12 princes. These are the forefathers of the Arab peoples and their clans. That's the verse in Genesis. So the Rambam's quoting, he's saying, you see, when King David was in Tehillim saying, woe to those people who dwell with Meshech and Kedar, King David was alluding to this. King David foresaw, being a prophet, that the Jewish people are going to end up living under the dominion of Kedar, of the person who came from Kedar, of Muhammad. And woe to them, because they're going to have to suffer under their oppression. And the Rambam continues. Although we were dishonored by them beyond human endurance and had to put up with their fabrications, yet we behaved like him who is depicted by the inspired prophet. Again, he's quoting from King David. But I am like a deaf man, I do not hear, like a mute who does not open his mouth. That's from Psalm 38. Similarly, our sages instructed us to bear the perversions and lies of Ishmael in silence. That's what the Rambam says. Our sages told us, don't fight it, don't struggle with Ishmael. Just bear what they're doing to you. They found a cryptic allusion for this attitude in the names of his sons, Mishma, Duma, and Masa. Right? We just read he had 12 sons. 3 of his sons' names were Mishma, Duma, and Masa. What does that mean? So the Rambam says it was interpreted to mean listen. Mishma means to listen, lishma. Duma means to be quiet, be silent. And Masa, what is a Masa? Masa is a burden. It's a burden, something heavy on you. So the Rambam says, our sages told us, this is what it means that Ishmael had 3 sons named Mishma, Duma, and Masa. The deeper meaning there is just, whatever. Listen, be quiet, bear the burden. Just endure, don't fight it. Okay? Don't speak up. We have acquiesced, the Rambam says, both old and young, to inure ourselves to humiliation. As Isaiah instructed us, so now he quotes from Isaiah chapter 50, I submitted my body to those who smite and my cheeks to those who pluck. So the Rambam is saying we're taking their pain, their persecution and their humiliation, and we're just silent.
Sorry, he's saying to take it?
He's saying that's what we've become. Okay. He's saying the Jews have started to do that. We stopped fighting them, and we're just taking this pain.
Okay, but not to actually do it on purpose.
No. He's saying it's unfortunate. He's saying our sages kind of told us to do this, and we acquiesced. And unfortunately, we're in this position now, where they have the authority and they do whatever they want with us and they mistreat us and they harm us and they persecute us and we just take it. We just take it in silence. And he continues and says, all this notwithstanding, we do not escape their intense oppression and ongoing attacks. No matter how much we suffer and elect to remain at peace with them, they stir up strife and sedition, as David described for us, and he's quoting again from Psalms, Psalm 120, I am peace, but when I speak, they are for war. That's straight from King David. Same verse. So that the whole verse in Psalms goes like this. Oya li ki galti meshech, like woe to me that I live with Meshech, had to live with Shachanti mo'alei Kedar, that I had to live with Kedar, which is an allusion to Muhammad and Ishmael, or Muhammad and the house of Islam. Rabat shachna la nafshi im soneh shalom, that I too long I'm living with these people who hate peace. Ani shalom v'chi adaber hemma lemilchama. I just want peace, and they always want war. That's what King David is saying, and that's what the Rambam is saying, that this is what we have to deal with. We just want to live in peace, but they can't live in peace. They're constantly causing war. And the Rambam's alluding to a concept in Islam, which is that the purpose and goal of Islam is to create a global caliphate. The whole world must be Muslim. There's no place in Islam for other religions. For Jews, we don't mind that there are other religions. Like, you can be a Christian if you need to be a Christian. You can be a Muslim if you need to be a Muslim. Just be a righteous person. There's like 7 fundamental Noahide laws, just basic moral principles of mankind. Just be like a good moral person, and you're good. You'll be in God's good graces, and there's a place for you in the afterlife. Like, we don't try to make everybody Jewish. Like, you can do your thing. But in Islam, they don't have that. Like, everybody has to be Muslim. In the Jewish worldview, there's room for everyone. But in the Muslim worldview, there isn't room for everybody. And in fact, the Muslim world divides itself up into the Dar al-Harb and the Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam and the house of Harb, the house of war. If you're not in the realm of Islam, you're in the realm of war. That's it. That's how the Muslim world is lined up. Like, you're either in the Islamic world or in the world of war, and you will be Islamic one way or another. We will make this global caliphate. And that's why the truth is, like, wherever there's Islam, there's war and conflict. And the same thing with the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? This whole idea is, in the past 70 plus 100 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's constantly Israel making overtures for peace, wanting to live peacefully, and the Arabs constantly rejecting it over and over and over again. They were given so many opportunities going back to 1948. The Arabs rejected the partition plan. They rejected everything. After 1967, they said there are 3 no's. We don't negotiate. We don't want no peace, no negotiation, nothing. They don't want anything to do with us. In 2000, at the Camp David meetings, Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton gave Yasser Arafat everything. They literally gave him everything he wanted, and he just got up and walked away and started an intifada right after. And you can Google Bill Clinton talking about it. There's a speech, you can see this video where Bill Clinton's asked about this, and he says, he literally says, these are his words. He says, I killed myself to bring peace to that region. We gave Yasser Arafat everything. He said 97% of the West Bank and land exchanges for the other 3%. Everything they wanted. He just walked out, just got up and left the table. No explanation. And started an intifada. They're not interested. They're not interested in peace. Right? Israel has no peace partner. So we're always trying to give them stuff. We disengaged from Gaza. We completely pulled out. And it was supposed to become the new Singapore of the Middle East. And what did they make out of it? Just a base for a bunker, a launching pad for missiles. Instead of using all the stuff that they're getting, all the billions of $8 and all that concrete to build skyscrapers. They could have been Dubai. And instead they build hundreds of miles of underground tunnels and weapons and rockets. They're not interested in peace. That's the problem. That's what King David is saying. I'm always trying to find peace. I am for peace, but they are for war. And they say it themselves. That's the funny thing. The Palestinians themselves admit it all the time. Right? And somehow the Western world fails to see it. I'll quote just one because he said it so well. Zuhair Musin, who was one of the PLO leaders, he said it in a 1977 interview. This is what he said. I'm quoting. He said, "The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel, for our Arab unity. In reality today, there is no difference between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people. Since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct Palestinian people to oppose Zionism." They admit it. They say it themselves. The Palestinian people only exist to fight Zionism. That's it. It was this whole idea of a Palestinian people was created solely to fight the Jews and to destroy the state of Israel. That is their whole existence. The famous Golda Meir quote basically says it best. If the Arabs put down their weapons, there would be peace immediately. Right? There would be no more war. If the Jews put down their weapons, there would be no more Israel. If the Arabs put down their weapons, there would be no more war. If the Jews put down their weapons, if the Israelis put down their weapons, there would be no more Israel. It's that simple. It's that simple. So, like King David said, we are for peace, they are for war. And yet, the world illogically hates Israel. And there's this blindness to the world. It just makes no sense that somehow, in the Western mindset, Israel has somehow become the bad guy in the media, on university campuses, among all the liberals, and it just makes no sense, right? Like that, you look everywhere in the world, the atrocities that are being committed are unfortunately being committed by extremist Muslims in the name of Islam. Whether it's in France, in England, they're beheading teachers in France, and they're blowing up subways and buses and trains in Madrid and in London and all over the world, everywhere where they are, in Africa and everywhere. But yet somehow the Jews are the bad guy. Somehow Israel's the bad guy. It's strange. It's absolutely bizarre. And it just goes to the point of stupidity of Israel now had to deal with this genocide claim, at The Hague. South Africa is saying, Israel's committing how is this a genocide? When the Palestinian population just keeps rising and rising and rising, the most ineffective genocide ever. And the irony is that the Muslims themselves are committing genocides in other parts of the world and nobody cares. I'll just give one example. In Indonesia, one of the worst genocides that's taking place right now is being perpetrated by the world's largest Muslim country, which is Indonesia. Indonesia is the number one largest Muslim country in the world. And they are committing a genocide. Anybody know against who? No, you see, you guys don't know about it because nobody talks about it. But in West Papua, there's that island, Papua New Guinea and West Papua. So Indonesia annexed it illegally in 1969. And since then, they've been carrying out an absolute genocide. They've killed at least 500,000 people over that time. They are constantly raping, pillaging, taking over resources. Why? Why do they want it? It has one of the largest gold reserves in the world, one of the largest copper reserves in the world. You've heard nothing about it. Right? Way more Papuans have been slaughtered by Indonesia than Palestinians, but nobody hears about it. Have you heard of one march on behalf of the West Papuans? Nothing. Nobody even knows about it. Nobody talks about it. So you have a Muslim country, the world's largest Muslim country, committing an ongoing genocide of a people for decades, and nobody cares. Not one UN resolution, nothing. Right? But somehow Israel's the bad guy. Right? So that's the craziness of it all. And it's hilarious that in the liberal world, the leftist liberal world is so opposed to Israel when the biggest threat facing the leftist liberals is Islam. Because everything that Islam stands for is the exact opposite of what the liberals stand for, whether it's women's rights, whether it's LGBTQ. Gay people are still being hanged in Iran regularly and being executed by Hamas. And yet you have queers for Palestine. How is this possible? How can there be a queers for Palestine? If these queers were in Palestine, they would be literally executed very quickly. And yet, instead of supporting Israel, they are somehow supporting Hamas. And it just makes no sense.
So how do you explain that?
I have no explanation for it. It's either just brainwashing, propaganda, ignorance. So Israel, that does so much good for the world, that invents so many things, whether it's like drip irrigation or whatever technology, ways, different apps, self-driving cars, you name it. Silicon Wadi in Israel is like one of the world leaders in high tech. But all of that nobody cares about that, right? So Israel is somehow the bad guy. The only democracy, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East is the bad guy. And all the other dictatorships, nobody cares about. Bashar Assad has killed hundreds of thousands of Arabs. Nobody cares. Assad can kill Arabs. Nobody cares. Right? Saddam Hussein can kill Arabs. Nobody cares. Right? Iran can kill its Muslims. Iran can arrest women who don't cover their head. If they don't wear a hijab, they go to jail and they get, we know what happens. Girls getting killed. But nobody cares about that. That's not... But Israel, Israel is the bad guy. So it's bizarre. I don't get it. I really don't understand it. And this really gets to the heart of the problem with Islam. I try to be a positive person, and I think there is hope. This is the issue. The issue with Islam is that it just doesn't fit in the 21st century. Islam has remained in the Middle Ages. It hasn't evolved at all. And other religions evolve. Judaism evolved. Christianity evolves. Judaism has evolved. For example, I'll give you a couple of simple examples. 2,000 years ago, polygamy was allowed. A Jew could have multiple wives. Today, a Jew cannot have multiple wives. Right? Polygamy is now not allowed in Judaism. So it was allowed then, it's not allowed now. Judaism is evolving. Islam doesn't have that. A Muslim could have multiple wives 1,000 years ago, and he could still have multiple wives today. It hasn't changed. Right? So polygamy is just one little example. In Judaism, it was allowed 2,500 years ago. By Talmudic times, it was already pretty much unheard of. I don't think there's a case in the entire Talmud of any of our sages that had multiple wives simultaneously, maybe one. But it was already pretty much unheard of. And by 1,000 years ago, it was already banned. That's it. I think there's this understanding that there's an ideal. The Torah always maintains monogamy as the ideal, as it should be. Adam and Eve. God says they should become one flesh. They should come back together. Monogamy is the ideal. It allows for polygamy, which we need to talk about why. And I want to do a separate class on polygamy and monogamy. The Torah always speaks very negatively about polygamy. Every case of polygamy in the Torah is a disaster, whether it's Abraham, Jacob, King Solomon, whatever. It's always spoken of negatively. The Torah implies that if you have multiple wives, inevitably one will be loved and one will be hated, and it'll create unnecessary conflict. But it was still allowed. So we have to talk about why it was allowed then if the Torah disparages polygamy so much, and it was clearly not an ideal. Why was it allowed? In any case, eventually we realized that, hey, it's time to ban this. Right? You can't have polygamy and a proper marriage and true love. It just doesn't work, right? Those two ideas don't go together. True love requires monogamy. So anyway, we'll talk about that another time. But just as an example of how Judaism is able to evolve and say, back then it was allowed, now it isn't. And there's many other examples. And Christianity has evolved, and other religions change over time. But Islam doesn't seem to want to change. There's never been a Muslim reformation. There's never been a reform movement in Islam. Christianity had a reformation. Judaism had a reformation. Now, obviously for us, in the religious, more orthodox world, whatever you want to call it, we don't agree with Reform Judaism, its fundamental principles. However, there were good things that came out of even the Jewish Reformation that we often don't realize, that rubbed off even on orthodoxy. For example, if you read about the early history of Reform a couple of hundred years ago, one of the early arguments that Reform Judaism made was something as simple as, we want on Shabbat, in shul, we want a sermon in English or in German, in the vernacular language, so that everybody can understand what's being said. That was very controversial 200 years ago. If you walked into a synagogue 200 years ago and there was a sermon that was given in the vernacular language, then that would have probably been a Reform shul. Because at that time it was considered, no, in Europe, you gave all your discussion, all the sermons were in Yiddish, or in the Sephardi world it would have been in Ladino or whatever local language. And it was considered controversial to bring some outside language, foreign language, into the synagogue. So that was one of the early arguments that Reform was making. Another one was, let's do women's programs and kids' programs. That was controversial 200 years ago, because until then, a synagogue was basically a gentleman's club. It was for men. Women were not expected to show up, and they weren't encouraged to show up, and neither were kids. So the first synagogues that pioneered women's programs, Rosh Chodesh events, classes for women, kids programs, they were Reform. And now everybody adopted that. In all Orthodox synagogues now, you have basically sermons in English or in whatever language, kids programs, women's programs, Rosh Chodesh, women's classes. So, yeah, we don't agree with reform, but they had some good ideas too. It wasn't all bad. They had good ideas that rubbed off on the rest of Orthodoxy. And other things, women's education. 200-300 years ago, Jewish women were not educated. They weren't expected to go to school. There were no schools the schools were all for men. Right? But then reform pioneered this idea of, hey, let's also educate the women. And then it rubbed off on Orthodoxy, right? With Sarah Schneer, if you guys know the story of the Beis Yaakov movement, Sarah Schneer pioneered to bring Jewish education even into the Orthodox world for Orthodox girls. And today, everywhere, even in the most ultra-Orthodox communities, girls get an education, which is wonderful. But we forget that was originally pioneered by Reform. So yes, we don't necessarily agree with Reform in terms of their ideology. We don't agree with Reform ideology, but they pioneered good things that then rubbed off on the rest of, even on Orthodox Judaism. That's bat mitzvah also, right? Until recently, there was no such thing as a bat mitzvah celebration. There was just bar mitzvahs. And now there's also a bat mitzvah. It's good, because you also want to celebrate girls and women, not just boys, right? So there's all these good things that were pioneered by Reform that was adopted by basically everybody. So Islam needs something like this, right? Islam needs a reformation that even the more traditional, conservative, fundamentalist Muslims, they might not agree with the reformers, but it will inevitably rub off on them. Those good ideas will spread. Good ideas have a way of spreading and becoming accepted by more people. So what Islam needs basically is a reformation. Like Judaism had, like Christianity had. Christianity, of course, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation in Christianity was really important for the Christian world and also forced the Catholic world to adapt, to stay relevant. Otherwise, they would have disappeared. So, and Protestantism did a lot of good for Christianity as well. And we also talked about that before. That Rav Yaakov Emden, one of the big chief rabbis in the early 1700s, the Yavetz, also spoke positively of Protestantism, of what Protestantism did for Christianity in helping to remove some of the idolatrous elements from Catholicism and so on, and other things, positive things. So the point is that religions evolve, but Islam hasn't, and it needs to. And so I want to stay hopeful that it will. In fact, there was, in 2015, a group of Muslims and Muslim scholars and religious leaders actually started the Muslim reform movement. So I don't know how successful they've been. It's been less than 10 years, but I wish them success because what it says on their website, at least, sounds very promising. And this is what Islam needs. And so I think that's a really good thing. And it goes back to what it says in that passage about Ishmael and his sons. And when he passed away, it says that Ishmael lived 137 years, ve'igva ve'yamot, and he died and he passed away. And there's a famous Rashi there that he quotes from our sages that says, ve'igva, that word means that Ishmael repented, that Ishmael was wicked in his youth, but he died righteous. And so there's a hope there that, if Ishmael is a model for the entire house of Islam, for the whole house of Ishmael, that they will also find their way. So I'm hopeful that Islam will actually improve and stop with all of this war and crises. Wherever Islam is, there's constant conflict. So that's the hope. So to summarize, going back to our original question, did Jews live well under Islamic rule? Well, according to the Rambam, absolutely not. 800 years ago, before there was Israel, the state of Israel, there was no Zionism, and yet the Rambam says that the oppression of Ishmael is much worse than anywhere else. This is the most degrading and humiliating life for Jews anywhere on the planet. And they've always persecuted us. So it's a complete myth, and it's totally not true. The Muslim hostility to Judaism has nothing to do with Zionism, has nothing to do with the state of Israel. It's already rooted in the religion itself, and going back all the way to the beginning. Muhammad himself, the whole Muslim calendar begins. You know in what year the Muslim year begins? Like we have a Jewish year, the Muslims have their year. The Muslim year begins in the year 622. 622 CE is the year one of the Muslim calendar. That's the year that Muhammad and his followers took over the Jewish town of Yathrib and turned it into Medina, which became, the city, the base of, literally means the city, the birthplace of Islam. And they took it over from Jews. At that time, there was about 20 different Jewish clans who lived in Yathrib. And there were three leading tribes, the Banu Qurayza, the Banu Nadir, the Banu Kainuka. And we spoke about this when we did the Judaism versus Islam class last year. So just to remind you from that class that Muhammad came into that city, took it over, and 5 years later he slaughtered the Jews. He killed at least 900 Jewish men were beheaded in 627. Muhammad himself and his men beheaded over 900 Jewish men. They had every woman and child enslaved. Muhammad took a Jewish woman named Rehana as a wife, forced her to be his wife, but she didn't accept him, and ultimately he let her go. She kept refusing to convert to Islam. She stayed a slave, and at the end he let her go. The following year was the infamous Battle of Khaybar in Saudi Arabia. And the Jewish tribes at that point surrendered. Muhammad had grown very strong. The Jewish tribes surrendered. That's when he instituted the jizya tax, and his tax was 50%. So he made them pay 50% of their wealth if they wanted to stay Jewish and not be killed for not converting to Islam. He found another Jewish woman that he wanted, whose name was Sophia. And she actually became one of the mothers of Islam. She's considered one of the mothers of Islam and an important link in their tradition of the Quran tradition of preserving stories about Muhammad. So a Jewish woman is actually one of the ima'ot of Islam, lehavdil, one of the mothers of Islam. And she didn't bear any children for Muhammad, and she actually left all her wealth to her Jewish nephew. But that massacre of Khaybar, it's very well known among the Muslims because it became a rallying cry. Every time Arabs kill Jews, to this day, you hear this at Palestinian marches, you know what they shout. They go, Khaybar, Khaybar, and they say, Ya Yahud, right? Like, go against the Jews. That's their slogan. Khaybar, Khaybar, let's slaughter the Jews. That's a slogan to this day. Palestinians say it all the time in all their marches. So in the same way that we saw on October 7th, the raping of women, abducting children, beheading men, this isn't new. This wasn't invented on October 7 a few months ago. This goes back to Muhammad's own time, to the year 627. Islam is literally born from the blood of the Jewish people. Literally, it begins. Year one on the Muslim calendar is when Muhammad took over a Jewish town in Saudi Arabia. 5 years later, he massacred its population. At least 2 of his wives were Jewish women that he abducted. So this is nothing new. This is from the very beginning of Islam. The hatred is not new. The persecution is not new. The violence isn't new. The killing is not new. Has nothing to do with the state of Israel. Has nothing to do with Zionism. And I'll remind you of a hadith that you've all heard before. Remember, Islam has an oral tradition. Like we have an oral tradition, they have the hadith, which is the companion to the Quran, the oral companion to the Quran. And the hadith, there's a famous hadith, al-Bukhari, and the Bukhari says, a verse, you Muslims will fight against the Jews and you will gain victory over them. The stones will betray them saying, oh Abdullah, right, slave of Allah, servant of Allah. There's a Jew hiding behind me, so come kill him. And the parallel hadith in Sahih Muslim says, the last hour will not come. The Akharit Ayamim, the end of days, the Mahdi, that whole thing. That the end of days won't come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews and the Muslims will kill them until the Jews will hide themselves behind a stone or a tree. And a stone or a tree will say, Muslim, O servant of Allah, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him. This is right in this, again, nothing to do with Israel. This is a hadith that goes back 1,000 years. Nothing to do with the state of Israel. Nothing to do with Zionism. The hatred of the Jews goes back centuries. It goes back all the way to the start of Islam. In the hadith, there's already a call to murder every last Jew, even the Jew that's hiding behind a tree or a stone. So that would explain why, and I'm going to conclude just a few more points. That will explain why, one of the founders of the Palestinian resistance, it's not Yasser Arafat. Who was the first person to object to Jews coming to Jerusalem, to come back to Israel? wasn't Yasser Arafat. It was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem 100 years ago. His name was, anybody know his name? Husseini. That's right, Husseini, Haj Amin al-Husseini, right? He was the guy who really started, the founder of the Palestinian, so-called Palestinian resistance. And you've seen pictures probably, that he was best friends with Adolf Hitler. There's photos of them together. He visited Hitler in Germany. They were good friends, and they collaborated, and Haj Amin was a big admirer of Hitler and hoped that Hitler would come and liberate the Middle East from the British. He actually lived in Damascus, and he hoped he was part of a new regime in Syria that was called the Arab Kingdom of Syria, which was declared in 1918, but it didn't last. And when that failed, he needed a new place to try to be the leader of, so he moved back to Jerusalem and started this whole Palestinian Arab nationalist movement. And he was the one that inspired the first massacres of Jews at the time. So the Hebron massacre in 1929, when about 70 Jews were killed, women were raped, Jewish houses were burned down, and then after that the British evacuated all the Jews out of Hebron. And that's why there were no Jews in Hebron until 1967, when Israel liberated it again. But that massacre, the 1929 Arab riots and the Hebron massacre in particular, were inspired by Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was a Nazi sympathizer and a collaborator with Hitler. And actually, in response to that, to the 1929 riots and the Hebron massacre, that's when the Haganah was formed. The Haganah, which became the IDF, it's called the Israel Defense Force because that's what it is. It's a defense force. It's not a force of aggression or conquest. The Haganah was founded, the IDF was founded after the Hebron massacre to protect Jewish people who were being just indiscriminately killed by Arab extremists, by Muslim extremists. That's how the IDF began. And the Nazi collaboration didn't stop with Husseini. It was also very prominent in Iraq. A lot of people don't know this, but in 1941, a pro-Nazi government took over in Iraq. And if you remember, Hitler, one of his slogans was that he hoped to connect Berlin to Baghdad. Hitler wanted Berlin to Baghdad. And so there was a pro-Nazi government in Iraq in 1941. And the British came back and quickly restored the pro-Anglo government. And after that happened, the Nazi sympathizers in Iraq actually started a massive pogrom against the Jews. It's called the Farhud, right? You've heard of the Farhud? At least 180 Jews were killed, but there are many unidentified bodies, and some say as many as maybe 600 more might have been. There was a mass grave that was found, and they think it's connected to this as well. So it could have been as many as 800 or 900 Jews were killed. 1,000 to 2,000 were injured. Something like 900 homes and Jewish businesses and homes were burned down and destroyed. So again, it wasn't October 7. And actually, this was on a holiday, just like October 7 was on a holiday. This was on Shavuot. It was in June 1941, where a bunch of Iraqi Nazis attacked Jews and slaughtered hundreds of Jews and raped and injured and burned down and did all these things. So this didn't start because of Israel. This was in 1941. The Nazi sympathy and collaboration is also not new and goes back a very long time. And in light of what it says in the Hadith, you can understand why they would do such things. So in short, there was never this Jewish-Muslim utopia that people talk about. It never existed. The Muslims did not treat the Jews well. There were good times. I'm not denying that. There were good times. There were peaceful times. The Ottoman Turks generally treated the Jews well, but the Arabs certainly rarely did. And most of the time it was as the Rambam said. It was humiliation and degradation and being a second-class citizen and being persecuted. And I'm sure most of us here are from Muslim countries, and we all have our stories of how our ancestors suffered in Muslim countries. And we know stories like the story of Solika and all these others, that just the oppression was widespread and it was quite terrible. So there was no such thing that before Israel, Muslims loved Jews and they lived so well together. No, they didn't. Right? And the Neturei Karta are absolutely crazy and the enemies of the Jewish people, pretending to be these supposedly ultra-Orthodox Jews, but they are imposters. You know, the Zohar and the Talmud and throughout Jewish literature, they speak of the Erev Rav. You know, people who are pretending to be visually very Jewish, but they are serving to do the exact opposite for the Jewish people. They just make divisions among us, they make us weak, and they collaborate with our enemies. So the Neturei Karta are exactly that. These are people who support Hamas. They march alongside Hamas. They shake hands and kiss Ahmadinejad, who wanted to wipe Israel off the map. Like, how can you, even if you're an anti-Zionist, fine, but how could you march with terrorists? How could you collaborate with people who call for the genocide of Jews? What kind of Jew in his right mind would do that? These people, are they Jewish? How can you be a Jew and collaborate with terrorists and whoever it is? Makes no sense. So this is the Erev Rav. The Zohar goes in depth about what the Erev Rav is and gives an acronym to identify them. It's called Negara, like to 5 qualities of who they are. And the last 2, Negara, Reish Ain, is Rephaim and Amalekim. Rephaim means weak. That they make the Jewish people weak from the inside. They make divisions within us and they make us weak. And Amalekim means they collaborate with Amalek. They collaborate with those who seek to destroy us and to exterminate us. And that's them. It's pretty clear. So just so that you're not confused, because people have been emailing me. This week I got a few emails saying, I saw on YouTube there's a rabbi who's saying that Jews and Muslims used to be best friends and it's all because of Israel and Israel's the bad guy and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, don't believe those Neturei Karta. So this myth is just perpetrated by ignoramuses and propagandists. Muslim massacres span from Muhammad himself to the Granada massacre in 1066 to the Tzfat massacre of 1834 to October 7 and every other year in between. My mom's here. She can tell you the story. Like in 1989, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, the Uzbekis were marching through the streets calling to exterminate all the Jews. Ethnic cleansing. We're going to wipe out all whoever's not Uzbeki and the Jews will be next. And my mom was pregnant with me, and she almost had a miscarriage from the fear. But maybe I wouldn't be here, because this is the kind of fear that was inspired by Muslim extremist terror, right? And then we came to Israel a year later, and guess what? More Muslims. And Saddam Hussein started launching rockets, and we were in bomb shelters, and we're in gas masks, right? And my mom always says that I wouldn't let her wear her gas mask because it would freak me out. Because I was little and she'd put on the gas mask. It's scary, the gas mask. So, and Saddam was launching rockets at us. So you leave one place, you go another part of the world, and there's still the same ideology is following you wherever you go. So I'll end with this prophecy. Saddam Hussein reminded me of this prophecy, just to show, again, going back to Ha'azinu, and how God, oivenu plilim, this idea of how God really weaves together the whole narrative of history. And that idea that the Rambam cited, oivenu plilim, that the nations judge us. So what does that mean? Like the Jewish people they go astray a little bit, like everybody else. Nobody's perfect. So God says, you know what, I'm going to wake you up. I'm going to send some little catastrophe, or not little, but I'll send a catastrophe to wake you up. Just like what happened on October 7th. It was a terrible, terrible, horrible tragedy. But in the wake of that tragedy, what followed was this incredible unity among Jews all over the world. In Israel, the months before, Israel was so divided, and there was so much unfortunate hatred between each other. And so all of that melted away, and people just came together. Because when you have an enemy like that, unifies the entire nation. We realize that, hey, let's stop being each other's enemies. There's enough people out there trying to kill us. We don't need to be after each other. And so God says, I'm going to do this to you. When I see you guys going off astray like this and starting to fight each other, I'll wake you up. And that's happened throughout history. But God does it in such a way, he said, this is mentioned in the Talmud, it's mentioned in the Zohar, that God says, I'm going to pick a nation to punish you that is themselves deserving of punishment. So that when they punish you, they're going to get it even worse afterwards, because they're even more deserving of it. I'm going to pick some despicable ideology to do this, and then I'll punish them too. And that's what oivenu plilim means. And so the Zohar speaks about this when it talks about in next week's Parsha, Parashat Beshalach, which has the Song of the Sea. Right? The Israelites crossed the sea. The Egyptians were drowned in the splitting of the sea. And then the Jewish people, the Israelites, sang a song, right? Shirat Hayam, very famous song. It's considered one of the kind of 10 eternal songs of history. 9 we're in Scripture in Tanakh, and the 10th will be sung by Mashiach. That's the tradition, that there's going to be 10 eternal songs that have deep prophecy in them and that are relevant for all time. So Parashat Ha'azinu is one of those 10 songs, and Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, is another one of those 10 songs. And if you notice, the Song of the Sea is written in future tense. It says, Az yashir Moshe uvnei Yisrael et hashira hazot. So our sages ask, what does that mean, Az yashir Moshe? Like, then Moshe will sing. It should have said, Shar Moshe, or Sharu Moshe uvnei Yisrael, right? They sang. But it doesn't say in the past tense, that after they crossed the sea, they sang. It says in the future tense, Az yashir Moshe, as if they will sing. And many of the verses in that song are actually in the future tense. And one of the verses says that God will ta'aros kamecha, that you will destroy all those who rose against you. And again, it's in the future tense, taharos kamecha. It should have said in the past tense, like, you subdued Pharaoh. It should have said aras or something, but it says ta'aros. So the Zohar says, what does that mean? It means that all those people who oppressed us in the past, God will bring them back in the future, and he will punish them. So all those people, and the Zohar lists who they are. It talks about Andrianus and Lufinus. It's really talking about Vespasian and Titus, who destroyed the second temple, Nebuchadnezzar, Sancheriv, right? Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian who destroyed the first temple. So God will bring them back and make sure to punish them one more time for what they did to the Jews. And this is something really amazing, because the Zohar says that, these people, it lists specifically 4 names, and other oppressors of Israel will return at the end of days, before Mashiach comes. Lezimna de atam shicha, in the time when Mashiach comes, God will bring these people back to punish them one more time. And he'll make it clear. And this is something really incredible. Because if you look at Nebuchadnezzar, the Zohar is saying Nebuchadnezzar will be back at the end of days before Mashiach comes, and God will punish him one more time. And the Zohar actually says that God will bring back everything they had. God will restore their wealth, and then he will punish them. Who was the Nebuchadnezzar in our day and age? Anybody know? I told you, Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein, who was the president of Iraq. Iraq is built on what was then Babylon. Saddam Hussein believed himself to be the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar. He spoke about this himself. He built himself a palace over the old palace of Nebuchadnezzar. He minted coins with his face overlaid over the face of Nebuchadnezzar. He literally thought himself to be the new Nebuchadnezzar. Right? He felt like he was building a neo-Babylonian empire. And so he thought of himself as Nebuchadnezzar. Like, this isn't me saying it, this is him saying it, right? You can look this up. And what's incredible is that, of course, he was very much punished and everything was taken away from him, and he was found hiding in a hole somewhere and was ultimately executed. And what's really amazing about this is a friend from Australia named Amir, he's going to hear this. So Amir in Australia pointed this out to me, that if you look at when Saddam Hussein was executed, that day was the 10th of Tevet. And we just had the 10th of Tevet a few weeks ago, it's a fast day. Why do we fast on the 10th of Tevet? What do we commemorate? So there's a few things that happened on that day in history, but the main reason that the fast of the 10th of Tevet was instituted, straight out of Scripture, right? It's mentioned in the prophets that we fast on the 10th of Tevet. Why do we fast on the 10th of Tevet? Because that was the day that Nebuchadnezzar first came to Israel and began the siege. Nebuchadnezzar's forces, I should say, first came to Israel and laid the siege on Jerusalem. So we fast on the 10th of Tevet because that's when the Babylonian destruction of Israel began. And fast forward 2,500 years, and Saddam Hussein, who himself said that he's Nebuchadnezzar. This isn't my idea. I'm just quoting him. He minted his own face onto Nebuchadnezzar. So the guy who's coming back 2,500 years later, who is the leader again of a new Babylonian so-called emperor, who had the 4th largest army in the world in 1990, at the time of the Gulf War. He had the 4th largest army in the world. So super rich, super powerful, says that he's Nebuchadnezzar, and of course, he ends up getting destroyed, and he gets executed on the 10th of Tevet. So we see again God's fingerprints throughout history, and we are reminded of what it says in Ha'azinu, that if you want to find God, just look through Jewish history. Zachor yamot olam binu shnot dor vador. And it's inevitable. You will find God there everywhere. God is just weaving this whole tapestry of Jewish history. So just like this prophecy in the Zohar came true, we are certain that the last sentence of this prophecy will come true, that this will happen in the Zimna de Atam Shicha, that when Mashiach will come. And it's just another piece of evidence that we are very close. So we'll end with that. Thank you very much.